Can you call yourself a superpower if your enemy controls your electrical heartbeat? If you ask any high-level official in the European Union that question today, the answer is a cold, hard no. For decades, we've heard the same stories about Europe's dangerous addiction to Russian energy. We know about the Nord Stream pipelines, the winter supply threats, and the geopolitical leverage of cheap gas. But beneath that well-known iceberg lies something much deeper and far more complex: the power grid. The grid is never just about transformers and wires. It is a meticulously designed physical system. The ultimate hard power contract is the most effective tool for political and economic infiltration ever devised by the Soviet Union and its successor, the Russian Federation. If oil and gas were the fingers Russia used to point at Europe, the cross-border power grid was the vascular system buried deep beneath the continent's skin. In February 2025, a historic milestone was reached. The Baltic states finally and permanently severed their connection to the Russian electrical system. This act essentially caused the massive Soviet-era vessels that had been feeding on European soil for over half a century to finally run dry. This 30-year electrical uprising marks the moment the last invisible shackle of the Soviet Empire was shattered. The geopolitical friction between Russia and Europe is often defined by what flows through pipes, but the real control was wired into the soil itself. This is the narrative of how the Soviet Union weaponized infrastructure to build a physical empire of electricity, a legacy of dependency that Europe has spent decades struggling to purge. Now that struggle has entered its most decisive phase, a total reconstruction of the continental grid designed to forge the first unified physical foundation for a truly sovereign Europe. Hashtag the Soviet leash. To understand why Eastern European nations are so anxious about their electricity today, you have to go back to the Cold War. The central planners in Moscow understood a very cold truth. Ideological brainwashing might eventually fail, but physical dependency is absolute. To ensure that the satellite states of Eastern Europe could never truly stray, the Soviet Union built a massive power system. This grid wasn't designed for economic efficiency or market competition. It was an architecture of obedience. The core logic of this system is what engineers call a hub-and-spoke model. In this setup, Moscow was the only hub, and countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and the Baltic states were merely spokes extending outward. On a physical level, this meant that the electrical frequency of the entire Eastern Bloc, that critical 50 Hz pulse that keeps the grid from exploding, was controlled from a single, windowless command center in Moscow. This became known as the BRELL loop. Inside this loop, electrons flowed without borders, but the heartbeat was managed by the Kremlin. In reality, this was a leash. Imagine a country like Lithuania or Estonia. They could declare political independence, change their flags, and join NATO. But in the physical reality of their daily lives, every refrigerator that hummed and every factory that ran depended on a hand in Moscow tweaking the frequency. If Moscow chose to lower that frequency even slightly, the Baltic grids would desynchronize, causing massive physical damage to infrastructure. This technical hostage status meant that even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, these nations remained under a form of soft occupation by Moscow. To the Soviet planners, this was the perfect imperial structure. You might be able to change your leaders, but you can't change your pulse. These substations and high-voltage lines were the terminal nerves of the Soviet Empire, reaching deep into the European landscape. This created a kind of geopolitical schizophrenia for 30 years. Their hearts belonged to Brussels, but their plugs were still stuck in Moscow. Hashtag the power decoupling. In the world of electrical engineering, disconnecting a major cross-border grid is a terrifying prospect. You can't just pull the plug. A grid is like a massive spinning engine that has to run at exactly the same speed as its neighbors to stay stable. If you disconnect without a massive backup system ready to catch the load, the sudden loss of that shared momentum can cause a total, catastrophic blackout for an entire nation. For 3 decades, the Baltic states and Ukraine lived with this fear. They were politically aligned with the West, but physically, they were still breathing through a Russian respirator. Then came February 24th, 2022. By a chilling stroke of historical irony, Ukraine's national grid operator, Ukrenergo, had scheduled a critical isolation test for that exact morning. It was a 72-hour maneuver where Ukraine would unplug from the Russian system to prove it could balance its own frequency before eventually joining the European grid. At 2 a.m., the breakers flipped. Ukraine became a physical electrical island. For hours later, the Russian missiles began to fall. This was a massive geopolitical trap. Standard logic suggested that under a full-scale military assault, Kiev should immediately beg Moscow to reconnect to keep the lights on and the water pumps running. But the leadership in Kiev realized this was their now or never moment to break the leash. They chose to stay isolated. For 21 days, while Russian missiles blasted substations and tanks rolled toward the capital, Ukrainian engineers kept the country's electricity stable on their own. It was a staggering feat of technical defiance that many experts thought was impossible during a total war. By mid-March, the European Union realized Ukraine had proven its self-sufficiency. In a move of strategic solidarity, they fast-tracked a decade of complex engineering into just over 2 weeks. On March 16, 2022, they synchronized Ukraine's pulse with the European system. The physical shackle that had existed for 70 years was finally cut. The final act of this decoupling didn't conclude until February 9, 2025, in the Baltic states. For Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, leaving the BRELL loop was the final physical step of desovietization. To survive without Moscow's frequency control, they spent over $2 billion on 9 machines called synchronous condensers. These are 300-ton spinning steel flywheels that provide the physical inertia the grid needs to stay steady. When the final switch was flipped in February 2025, the Baltics didn't just plug into Europe, they completed a strategic divorce that had been decades in the making. The Soviet-era vessels that once fed Europe have dried up. But as these nations plug into the Western supermachine, they are finding that the new house they've moved into is far from harmonious. With the external threat severed, the focus has shifted to the heart of Europe. Why is the EU spending hundreds of billions to build energy highways from the Sahara Desert to the North Sea? And how is this new grid being used to force a United States of Europe into existence, whether the member states like it or not? #reconstructing the grid. With the Soviet ghost finally exorcised from the East, the European Union has moved into a new phase, using the power grid to build a physical foundation for a truly sovereign Europe. This isn't just about moving electrons, it's about redrawing the map of European power from the ground up. Brussels has realized that strategic autonomy is just a slogan unless the continent is physically wired together. The goal is to transform Europe from a collection of national energy islands into a single, massive supermachine. If this succeeds, the EU will possess a level of economic resilience that would make it a true global peer to the United States and China. The first part of this reconstruction is the south to north pivot. For decades, Europe looked east for its energy. Now it is looking south and north. One of the most strategic projects is ELMed, a 600-megawatt undersea cable connecting Sicily to Tunisia. On paper, it's a way to pipe solar power from the Sahara into the European market. But geopolitically, it's a leash in the other direction. By wiring North Africa into the European heart, the EU is creating a permanent, physical link that makes the Maghreb dependent on European stability and regulations. It is a way to export European influence without firing a single shot. If you control the network that keeps a neighbor's economy breathing, you don't need a treaty to ensure their cooperation. At the same time, the EU is turning the North Sea into a green power plant. Massive offshore wind hubs are being planned as hub-and-spoke systems, where artificial islands will collect wind energy and distribute it simultaneously to multiple countries like Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. This creates a physical federation, a world where no single country can be cut off because everyone is plugged into the same central heart. However, building this supergrid is revealing a deep conflict between EU law and national sovereignty. The European Commission is now using grid integration as a tool to consolidate power in Brussels. They are pushing for a unified electricity market where a central regulator, ACER, can tell a sovereign nation like Poland or Hungary how to run their wires and what prices to charge. The EU's message is clear. If you want the security of the supergrid, you have to hand over the keys to your national energy policy, in other words, part of the sovereignty. This has led to a massive legal and bureaucratic trench war. It currently takes an average of 15 years to get a permit for a single cross-border cable in Europe. In the United States, we see a similar struggle where the federal government fights with states that refuse to let power lines cross their land. But in Europe, the stakes are existential. If a country like France or Germany loses control over its own grid, it loses one of the most fundamental tools of state power. As the EU tries to stitch these sovereign nations into a single machine, they are running into a wall of human nature and local politics. But the biggest obstacle isn't a small-town protest or a slow-moving bureaucrat. It's the fact that the two biggest players in the Union, France and Germany, have realized that in a truly unified grid, only one of them can be the dominant industrial power. The Russian leash is gone and the new grid is being built, but the supermachine is currently being torn apart from inside. Why is France using the grid to stage a nuclear coup against Germany? And what happens to the European project when its two leaders realize that in a unified market, one country's cheap power might be another country's industrial death sentence? #Power Games of the EU. If the battle on the Eastern Front was a high-stakes war of independence, the battle at the heart of Europe between France and Germany is a cold-blooded industrial divorce proceeding. Both sides are currently fighting over who gets to hold the remote control for the continent's economy. At the center of this power play are two diametrically opposed visions for the future of Western power: France's nuclear fortress and Germany's renewable experiment. France is currently sitting on the most formidable baseload of carbon-free energy on the planet. With 56 nuclear reactors, Paris views a highly integrated European grid not as a climate project, but as a giant cash register. If the wires are thick enough to cross the borders without bottlenecks, France can export its cheap, steady nuclear electrons to every corner of the continent. To Emmanuel Macron, strategic autonomy looks a lot like a map where every high-voltage line eventually leads back to a French reactor. This is, quite literally, a form of electrical hegemony, making every factory in Europe a paying customer of French nuclear power. Then there is Germany. On paper, Germany is a green superpower, but physically, it has a broken spine. Most of Germany's wind capacity is in the stormy north, while its heavy industry, the car plants and chemical giants of Bavaria, is in the south. Because Germany's internal north-south power highways have been blocked for a decade by local protests, the north is often drowning in excess wind power, while the south is forced to fire up expensive gas plants. This is where the bidding zone war turns ugly. The EU's energy regulator, Acer, backed heavily by France, has been pushing a radical proposal, splitting Germany into multiple price zones. The logic is simple but brutal. If Bavaria doesn't have the wires to receive cheap wind from the north, then Bavarians should pay a higher electricity price that reflects that physical reality. For Berlin, this is an industrial nightmare. Splitting the country into different price islands would mean a factory in Munich suddenly pays 20% or 30% more for power than a factory in Hamburg. It would shatter the national industrial unity that has underpinned the German economic miracle for a century. France is using this regulatory pressure as a geopolitical lever. Is a nuclear coup played out in the fine print of EU law? While Germany is busy building expensive LNG terminals and praying the wind blows harder, France is positioning itself as the only player capable of providing the firm power a 21st century industrial superpower needs. Even the United Kingdom, which tried to escape European rules through Brexit, has found itself trapped by this reality. Politically, London has taken back control. But physically, the UK is an electrical island that is more dependent on the European Union than ever before. To prevent winter blackouts, London has to follow the standards set in Brussels to keep the undersea cables flowing. In the world of energy, physics always trumps political slogans. There's no such thing as a truly sovereign exit from the grid. Hashtag sovereign federation or fragmented maze. So, what is the final verdict on the 2050 supergrid? If it works, the European Union becomes the world's first true physical federation. A world where a surplus of sun in Spain can instantly power a factory in Poland would create a level of economic resilience that even the United States or China would envy. It would be the final victory of integration over a bloody history. But if it fails, if the Franco-German industrial civil war continues, and if national protectionism prevents the cables from being built, Europe will remain a collection of squabbling, expensive energy islands. In that scenario, strategic autonomy will remain a hollow slogan, and the continent will be left increasingly irrelevant on a global stage dominated by powers that actually have their physical act together. In the 21st century, true power doesn't just come from the barrel of a gun or even the generation of a kilowatt hour. It comes from the network. The grid is the ultimate hard power contract that will determine whether Europe can finally stitch its fragmented history into a unified future. The Great Stitch is underway, but the needles are sharp and the thread is incredibly expensive. The question remains, when the next crisis hits, who will really be holding the switch?